Hello and welcome to Birth and Baby Talk. I'm Leanne Palmerston from Hamilton Family, and I'm going to be your host today. And I'm talking about one of the biggest myths around formula feeding. We're going to debunk that myth today. And that myth is that if you feed your baby formula, your baby's going to be fat. Your baby's going to grow up to be a fat kid and a fat teenager and probably a fat adult. So, if you've heard that and that made you feel pretty uncomfortable, let's dig into it. So where does that idea come from? Well, like most claims around breastfeeding, it comes from a couple of places. The one place folks are hoping to get validation for that claim is in the studies. So there have been studies. In fact, there's been a lot of studies done that touch on the idea that bottle and formula feeding leads to obesity later in life for those children. And when we're talking about studies, I want you to know I'm a huge, huge believer in science, but there are limitations sometimes to science. So when we can do studies, we can do lots and lots of studies, but we're limited by the design and scope of the study. So what type of study was it? When we talk about a gold standard for scientific studies, we're talking about something called a double-blind randomized trial. That's often where you have people who are participating in the study. Let's say they're taking a medicine to find out if that medicine is effective. So let's say you have 5,000 people and 3,000 of those people take the drug and 2,000 of those people take a candy pill. And none of the people who are participating, including the researchers who are speaking to each participant, know which medicine or non-medicine is being used. They don't know who's taking what. So whenever someone says, oh, well, I had headaches all day yesterday after I took my medication, and then the day after I was sick to my stomach, researchers record that information, and then afterwards, when they get to the analysis phase, they can reveal which of the participants took the medication, which ones took the placebo, which is an ineffective stand-in for the medication. They can figure out who took what and then see, oh, look, it looks like everyone who was taking this medication, or most of them, had headaches every time they took the medication. And we can look and see and verify that information. So that is what we call gold star scientific information. And it's really important to gather that information. With breastfeeding studies, you can't do that. You can't decide, you, Jane, are going to breastfeed your baby, and you, Sarah, Bob, are going to use a formula. So it's not possible to do that. So what we end up doing is using observational studies and self-reporting, and those are flawed, partly because if you have ever self-reported anything before, like anyone ever done one of those studies where you're supposed to write down everything you watch on television for a week and they send you a toonie in the mail? How many of you sort of fudged your reporting? How many of you actually wrote it down in the moment? And how many of you went at the end of the week and went, what did I watch? On Monday, I think I watched Game of Thrones. And then on Tuesday, I think I binge watched everything on the Netflix recommends list. So that might not be accurate, right? So sometimes we know that some types of studies are less accurate than others. And so breastfeeding studies end up being on the scope of less accurate. And some studies, even though they're observational and self-reporting, are designed really well, and some are designed not so well. So that's the first thing we have to take into account when we're thinking about, is this thing I'm reading correct? What kind of study was this based on, where this information was got? And then when we analyze that information, like when we do get those observations and that self-reported information, and then we take it and look at the information through the lens of what we're studying, there can often be something called confounding factors. So a confounding factor is one where it appears as if the effect we're looking at comes from the thing we're studying, but really it comes from somewhere else. And there's a really interesting one of these, which have to do with drinking coffee in pregnancy. So if you've ever had a baby or you're pregnant now, you've probably heard you really should stop drinking coffee. You really should to dramatically reduce your coffee and caffeine intake, because there are studies that show that high levels of caffeine intake are associated with high levels of miscarriage. Now, on the surface, it looks like if you drink a lot of coffee, you might be subject to a lot of miscarriages, which is awful, right? So of course you want to stop drinking coffee. But when we dig into the actual study and have a look at it, what we're actually seeing is probably the fact that people who tend to drink a lot of coffee in their daily lives also tend to have extremely stressful work. And those jobs that are extremely stressful lead to a lot of coffee drinking, and they often come with very bad sleep patterns, extremely long days at work. Let's think about your average sort of corporate lawyer who may be doing not 40-hour weeks, but they might be doing anywhere from 60 to 80-hour weeks. And in order to accomplish that in their high stress work environment, they may be drinking 7 or 8 cups of coffee a day. And they may be doing that day in and day out over long periods of time. Well, it certainly looks like if you are a pregnant lawyer and you've had a couple of miscarriages, or it's very common for people in your profession to have miscarriages, it's actually the stress that's causing it. The stress is the confounding factor in a study about whether caffeine leads to more miscarriages in pregnancy. So with breastfeeding studies, there are similar confounding factors. And one of the major confounding factors is the fact that someone has either chosen to formula feed or chosen to breastfeed. And along with that, so we know that making the choice to breastfeed is the major factor in success for breastfeeding. So that's the first thing. That seems almost a weak finding, doesn't it? The next thing is socioeconomic status. What we know about people who choose to breastfeed and people who choose to formula feed for the majority of their infant feeding, we know that the people who are able to breastfeed their baby for a year, 2 years, possibly a little longer, to do so in an exclusive fashion in that first year, those are people with an enormous amount of privilege. Those are people with good paying jobs who are able to take time off of work for long periods of time, who have potentially the economic or just social privilege of being able to hire folks who can help with helping with breastfeeding, potentially being able to help folks like myself, a doula, who can come and assist with breastfeeding, assist with the early postpartum chores. in order to make it easier for those people who are breastfeeding to breastfeed. So what that means is people with less economic privilege often have higher rates of formula use. And the other thing that they have is they often have slightly poorer diets. The person who does not have the economic privilege of staying home for a year or two with their baby to exclusively breastfeed is also a person who probably can't afford organic food, a very vegetable heavy diet, high sort of quality sources of proteins and things. They may be eating a lot more convenience foods. They may be eating a lot more fast foods in their diet. They may not pay for gyms and things. They may not have the economic power to put their children into like gym class or hockey and all the kinds of physical activities that go along with fitness for children and young adults. And so what we start to see is a socioeconomic difference that leads to more people being overweight who have less economic privilege and social privilege in the world. So that's the major confounding factor here. But there's also all kinds of other things. And there's one thing that I feel like is a huge factor that no one's really looking at. Now, one study looked at the amount of milk fed to a baby. So I have a bottle here. This is, I'm sure you've seen these. There are short bottles and there are really tall bottles. And with smaller babies, we tend to use these bottles. And then when babies start to get around 3-4 months old and they start having really big appetites, we graduate to the larger bottles because the larger bottle can just plain old hold more. This tops out at 5 ounces or 150 mils. And generally, an older baby can drink 6+ ounces or more than 150 mils in a single meal. So, what's one study looked at was the fact that if you fed babies, smaller babies, if you had a bottle that fed them 6 or more ounces at a go, and you put that much food into the bottle and fed the baby would learn to overeat over time and therefore become fatter. So it's not, again, the formula itself. It's how the formula is fed to a baby that can cause the issues with the obesity down the road. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. I do want to make sure, though, that you understand I'm not making this stuff up off the top of my head, and I'm not ranting out of nothing. I've got a couple of books here that I have in our practice here at Hamilton Family Doulas, at Toronto Family Doulas, and Family Doulas of Ottawa. Of course, we always have said that we base our information in real, actual science, real evidence-based information. And some of that comes from books like this, The Informed Parent by Tara Hale and Emily Willingham. And they have this to say that another long-term study of more than 35,000 women found no link between lifetime obesity risk and whether they were breastfed. And dozens of other studies are similarly contradictory. So they start off in this section saying the evidence shows a range of 15 to 30% lower risk of obesity among babies who breastfed. However, there are hundreds of studies around the world that show no or very tenuous connection between formula use and obesity. In this amazing book, if you are a parent who is planning to bottle feed or who is switching out of breastfeeding into bottle feeding full time, and you're maybe a little nervous about it, I want to, where are we? Here we go. There we go. Guilt-Free Bottle Feeding. This is a fantastic book by Madeleine Morris with Dr. Sasha Howard. And I want to read this little segment from it. A systematic review published in 2013 by the World Health Organization, no less, found a small reduction of about 10% in the number of overweight or obese kids who were breastfed longer, but it also added that it wasn't possible to rule out other factors being responsible for this. And the protective effect of breastfeeding may be overestimated by publication bias and residual confounding. So, publication bias, so we talked about the confounding factors, and a big confounding factor being A, the choice to breastfeed, and B, the socioeconomic status of a family. The other thing that happens is the information in studies, like the studies are done by scientists, but you don't learn about them until someone who is a science or health communicator takes that information and gives it to the world. So a health communicator is like a journalist who maybe talks in a podcast or writes articles for the Atlantic Monthly or the Washington Post or the Toronto Star, the Hamilton Spectator, all of those places, or even like the BBC, Al Jazeera, like there's so many of them in the world. But so health communicators use news and other communication platforms to take the information that's in the studies and then tell you about it. But in order to tell you about it, they have to distill it down. Like they can't tell you the 7,000 words that are in the study with all the, the graphs and gathered information. They have to break it down and they have to simplify it for you. And it's in the practice of simplifying the message in order to make it easily shareable and understandable by the average person. We start to lose those nuances and confounding factors until what we end up with is this oversimplified message. Formula feeding can lead to obesity in children and young adults. That oversimplified message is not just oversimplified, it's miscommunicated because it's not a complete message. There is potentially a kernel in there, but it's lost all of the information that contextualizes it. So no, formula feeding doesn't necessarily lead to babies, toddlers, children, teenagers, young adults who are overweight or have a greater risk of being overweight. And of course, that leads to things like diabetes, etc., which the studies also say use of formula has a higher risk attached to it of creating diabetes in people. The studies may say that, but that's not what's true. What's true is that having a diet that is low in certain types of foods and high in other certain types of foods, having a lifestyle that may involve less physical activity, all of those things are confounding factors for leading to childhood, adolescent, adulthood obesity and potential risks for disease related to obesity. It's not a sexy message, though, is it? It's far easier and sexier to say formula leads to obesity. So I promised here that that I'll also show you a major factor. And this, I had a revelation about this a few years ago when I was learning something called paced bottle feeding. And paced bottle feeding is a practice of feeding a baby. And I'm going to use our lovely Bob. We can imagine that Bob is sitting on my lap upright. And let me see, I'm going to get a little box and sit Bob on a box so we can demonstrate this well. So we're going to imagine that I'm sitting Bob on my lap, and Bob is a newborn baby or a small baby. And if I would like to feed Bob a bottle, I can use this paced method. I can let Bob capture this bottle and drive the feeding behaviors himself. So, and I can slow down the feeding by doing it this way in order to make Bob work a little harder for his meal so that he's not gobbling food down really fast. And this is especially important for anyone who wants to breastfeed and bottle feed and have neither interfere with the other. What we sometimes see is when you are breastfeeding a baby and then you start to introduce a bottle, the baby will get frustrated going back to the breast, because when you drink from a bottle in a traditional way, that food arrives to the baby at a very fast pace. And I'm just going to move the box. The food arrives very quickly, fills up a baby's belly really fast, but also bypasses that satiation. Have you ever gobbled down a meal really fast because you were so hungry and the food looked amazing and you were really excited to eat it, and then you got to the end of the meal and you thought you might burst? Well, that's because you ate too fast. Your mom told you that once, didn't she? She said, slow down, you're eating too fast. Well, when you eat too fast, you don't notice those signals, those hormones going to your brain that say, you're full, you can stop eating now. Because if you did eat slower, you might only eat about half of the things that are on your plate. And it's the same for a baby. When a baby drinks a bottle, I really got to find a way to keep Bob's arms down a little. When a baby drinks from a bottle, in a traditional way, they're drinking really fast. And they don't have a lot of control over the pace that they're feeding at and the volume of food. I don't know if you've ever fed a baby with a bottle. Did you ever get near the end of the bottle, have the baby kind of slow down and decide maybe they're finished, and then kind of harass the baby to try to finish what was in the bottle so they don't waste it? Have you ever gone, come on, there's just a little bit, let's finish this up, and tried to tickle the baby's mouth with the nipple to get them to start sucking again? I know I'm guilty of it. And I'm guilty of it going back for many, many decades. So if I'm guilty of it, most of us are probably also guilty of it. And if we've been doing that, essentially what we're doing is we're force feeding a baby faster than a normal pace of feeding. We're filling up their bellies super quickly. They're not able to realize that they're full until after they're twice as full. And so for a baby who is fed this way, what they understand about food is that when they feel like that Christmas dinner full, that Thanksgiving, gotta undo my belt because now I'm a giant blob and I feel like I could burst. That kind of feeling is what a formula fed baby who is fed in a reclining position like this feels is normal. And when you feel that is the normal feeling for full, you're going to chronically overeat. You're going to do that your whole life or most of your life. And you're probably going to retain more calories and energy in the form of fat on your body over a long time. Now, I don't think being fat is terrible. I'm a chubby bunny myself, and I'm a very happy person. But I hate the idea that people who are struggling with feeding issues, who would really like to use bottles and formula instead of breastfeeding for various reasons, whether it is they just plain old don't want to breastfeed, all the way to there is no milk being produced by those breasts, or there is a complication with the baby that makes feeding at the breast difficult. No matter what reason, you shouldn't be made to feel like if you're going to feed your baby formula, you're dooming your baby to a lifetime of obesity and potentially chronic diseases associated with overweightness. And yeah, because that sucks. You don't need that stress. There's enough pressure in the world. So there's definitely some things that you can do to mitigate the effects of potentially raising your baby's levels of obesity, or the potential for becoming obese later in life, and that is simply eating slowing down the pace that your baby feeds from their bottle at. So using something like paced bottle feeding, you certainly don't have to sit a baby completely upright. You could have a baby slightly reclining, but still keeping their bottle, instead of tipped straight up, keep it tipped down to make it a little slower while your baby's feeding. That's definitely one thing you can do. You can also make sure that your baby has opportunities to be active, or not your baby, like your toddler, your children, your teens, making sure that they have opportunities to be physically active, prioritizing things like physical activity in your life, prioritizing things like a varied diet of whole foods where possible. Those things are going to be a bigger factor in having your baby grow an amazing, healthy, wonderful body, whatever the size may end up being. So I hope that if you were worried that feeding your baby formula was going to turn them into a giant hulking monster of doom, I hope we debunked that myth. And I want to thank you for hanging out with us today. And if you, we're going to be talking about next week, we're going to be talking with Megan Bowser-Taylor from Family Doulas of Ottawa, and we're going to be talking about depression in pregnancy. And that is a thing that happens, and we're going to talk about it, talk about how to recognize it and how to manage what you should do. Okay, so thank you again for joining us. If you don't follow us on Instagram or here on Facebook, please follow us at Birth and Baby Talk. And also grab the link. I'm going to leave the link a little later. I'm going to pop a comment in here so that you can join our newsletter where you can stay on top of all the stuff going on in the Toronto, Ottawa, and Hamilton doula agencies. As well as, let me look up. If you are in our newsletter, you will know that every month we have a coupon, and this month's coupon is for planning services. We offer an amazing birth planning or postpartum planning, I'm telling you, the postpartum planning is the bomb service. It's not terribly expensive, and it is honestly one of the absolute best things you can do to get ready for your baby. If you are facing having a baby in this crazy pandemic where you're not going to be able to have help at home as you recover and learn how to take care of your baby, you're going to want to take one of these planning sessions because it will give you everything you need to know about how to plan for a really great, calm, and satisfying postpartum recovery. So thanks. See y'all next time, folks.